Mao's government was barely a year old and in the midst of radical reforms. It could hardly afford a war, but Mao felt the UN forces were an intolerable threat to China's security. Under the command of General Peng Dehuai, 250,000 Chinese troops secretly crossed into Korea. At the end of October 1950, they attacked, taking the UN forces completely by surprise. The UN troops soon fled in a massive retreat. In China, the government launched a propaganda campaign called Resist America and Aid Korea. By the spring of 1951, the war was a grim stalemate. Both sides were dug in around the 38th parallel, separating North and South Korea. While fighting continued, peace talks began. In China, the war created great national pride. The Chinese army had suffered terribly, with nearly 1 million casualties. But it had fought to a standstill the armies of the strongest nations in the world. And the Resist America campaign proved how effectively Mao's government could mobilize the entire country. Now it began a series of smaller campaigns against people inside China, people Mao called enemies without guns.
应当向其向政府坦白，应当在国际上这种开展一个反行贿、反偷税漏税、反盗取国家资财、反偷工减料的斗争。全国的一切外部同胞都应当团结起来，战胜这些旧社会遗留下来的无德而斗争。
Party officials encouraged people to act as informers using special letterboxes. Thousands were jailed or executed. People with money, with foreign connections, or with ties to the previous regime. With these campaigns, the communists crushed all potential political opposition. But the vast majority of people were not hurt by the campaigns. For many Chinese, life was improving.
我们有充分的信心，克服一切艰难困苦。 将我国建设成为一个伟大的社会主义共和国。
With the help of Soviet advisors, Mao's government began dozens of huge industrial projects. This development and Soviet help had to be paid for. Mao looked to China's peasants to foot the bill. But traditional family farms could not produce enough to pay for industry. In 1953, the communists began to socialize agriculture. First, they encouraged families to pool their property in small farms called cooperatives. Cooperatives grew at an astonishing speed. By the end of 1955, almost 2/3 of the peasants had joined. This was much faster than Mao had ever hoped. Seizing the momentum, he ordered the country to move to the next stage of socialism, to collectivization. But for most peasants, this was going too far. In collectives, private property was abolished. People had to give up their animals, their tools, and their land. Party officials put intense pressure on families to join. Within months, all of China's 600 million peasants were working in huge collectives. For the first time in history, the farm output of the entire nation was under government control. The government decided how much grain the peasants could keep. The rest had to be sold at low prices to the state. Collectives did not make the peasants better off, nor did they increase production. Mao still had to find a way to finance his vision of an industrial China.
毛主席曾经这样说过：“你们年轻人是朝气蓬勃、正在兴旺时期，好像早晨8、9点钟的太阳。希望寄托在你们的身上。孩子们，做出新的、更好的成绩，保证完成任务。”
The communists controlled most intellectual life. Plays and films had to follow strict guidelines. Mao saw that this control was stifling potentially useful new ideas. He was also disturbed by the emergence of a new elite in the party itself. In 1956, Mao decided to encourage constructive criticism of the party. He called for 100 flowers to bloom in the arts and 100 schools of thought to contend in science. Yu Beijian called many high school teachers unqualified. Shang Dashi complained medical research was falling behind. More and more people criticized party corruption and inefficiency. Under pressure from the party, Mao reversed himself. In June 1957, he published an article calling the people who had spoken out enemies and rightists. Mao appointed Deng Xiaoping to lead the anti-rightist movement. The rightists were denounced in front of their colleagues in struggle meetings. Professor Ge Peiqi was criticized in this meeting at the People's University in Beijing.
不可是没有一个党呀，相信党吗？党就是我们的救星，怎么会党接外10万8千里？我相信你可能会党接近10万8千里吧？你不相信党吗？
那么这党的关系呢？这是我个人的感觉是吧？我觉得呢，就是在这个解放以后到现在呢，不与在解放以前那时候那么亲密，这是我的感觉是吧？ 那至于说那个10万8千里啊，那些词啊都是这个用作为形容，很不恰当的。就说一疏远，这是我到现在一个这么一个感觉上，我感觉可能不对的哈。
你站在什么立场发的呀？你还是站在你人民教师、人民大学的讲师的立场发呀？你还是代表你过去少将的阶级立场发呀？你说的这些话，你是代表哪一个？
Ge Peiqi's family was ostracized for years. Ge Peiqi himself spent the next 2 decades doing hard labor. In an internal party document, Mao estimated that about 10% of the people were rightists. Local officials interpreted this to mean they had to find 10 rightists among every 100 people. Nearly 1 million people were condemned as rightists. They were sent to jail and prison camps or to work in the countryside. The anti-rightist campaign effectively silenced China's intellectuals. Mao had decided that they were no longer needed. Mao was also beginning to question China's relationship with the Soviet Union. When Nikita Khrushchev and Mao met in 1958, they kept up appearances of solidarity, but in private they disagreed on major issues. During the visit, Mao did not tell Khrushchev that he was about to launch military action against his old enemy, the nationalists.